Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. For the last 4 years, few foreign policy issues have divided American conservatives more than the war in Ukraine. Some Republicans argue that supporting Ukraine is essential to protecting America's long-term strategic interests. Others insist that every dollar spent overseas is a dollar that should be spent securing America's own borders, reducing the national debt, or rebuilding the country's economy. Both sides claim to represent the true meaning of America first. And that's what makes this debate so fascinating. This week, however, something happened that almost no one expected. Laura Loomer, one of Donald Trump's most outspoken allies and one of the loudest voices in the MAGA movement, announced that she had changed her mind about Ukraine. For years, Loomer had been one of the strongest critics of U.S. support for Kyiv. She questioned American aid. She echoed many of the arguments commonly heard among conservative skeptics of the war. She repeatedly criticized Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and argued that Washington should focus on America's problems instead of another country's conflict. Then she traveled to Ukraine. She visited cities damaged by Russian attacks. She met with President Zelensky. She spoke with Ukrainian civilians. And when she returned home, she surprised many of her own supporters. In interviews, Loomer admitted she had underestimated what Ukrainians were facing. She even suggested that some of her previous opinions had been influenced by Russian disinformation. Whether you agree with her new position or not, it was a remarkable political reversal. Naturally, the internet exploded. Some conservatives accused her of betrayal. Others praised her for having the courage to change her opinion after seeing the situation firsthand. Progressive commentators celebrated her remarks as proof that even some MAGA figures were rethinking their positions. But before jumping to conclusions, it's worth asking a more important question. Is this really a story about Laura Loomer? Or is she simply reflecting a larger conversation taking place inside today's Republican Party? Because I don't think the biggest story is that one political influencer changed her mind. The bigger story is what her decision may reveal about the future of the conservative movement. One thing often gets lost in today's political climate. Changing your opinion isn't necessarily a sign of weakness. In a healthy democracy, people should be willing to reconsider their views when confronted with new information or new experiences. Throughout history, political leaders, military commanders, and journalists have all changed their conclusions after witnessing events firsthand. That doesn't automatically make their new conclusions correct. Visiting a country for several days doesn't make anyone an expert. Governments naturally present visitors with the version of events they want them to see. The United States does it. Ukraine does it. Every government does. So one trip should never become the sole basis for forming an opinion. Still, first-hand experience has value. It provides information that simply can't be obtained through television clips or social media posts. And in today's digital world, where opinions are often formed long before people encounter reality, that matters. But here's where the story becomes much more interesting. Laura Loomer isn't just another conservative commentator. She has long been one of the most recognizable voices within the MAGA movement and has enjoyed unusually close access to President Trump. Her views don't represent every Republican, but they do influence a portion of the conservative grassroots. That's why her comments drew so much attention, not because they changed American foreign policy, but because they immediately raised a larger question. Is the Republican Party changing? Is MAGA changing? Or is this simply one person's personal journey? The truth is probably more complicated than either side wants to admit. The media often portrays the Ukraine debate as a battle between hawks and isolationists. Reality is far more nuanced. Today's Republican Party contains at least 3 different schools of thought. The first argues that America should dramatically reduce its overseas commitments. Supporters point to rising debt, illegal immigration, inflation, crime, and economic uncertainty. Their question is simple. If Washington keeps spending resources abroad, who's taking care of America? A second group reaches the opposite conclusion. They argue that allowing aggression to succeed often creates much larger and far more expensive conflicts later. From their perspective, helping Ukraine now may prevent a far greater crisis in the future. Then, there's a third, and perhaps the fastest-growing group. These conservatives don't necessarily oppose supporting Ukraine. They simply believe Europe should shoulder much more of the burden. After all, America's allies have the resources and the responsibility to do more for their own security. Notice something important. All three groups believe in putting America first. They simply disagree about how to achieve that goal. That's why this debate isn't really about patriotism. It's about strategy. How should the United States protect its interests in an increasingly unstable world? And that's why Laura Loomer's story matters. Not because one activist changed her opinion, but because her experience shines a spotlight on a debate that has been quietly reshaping the Republican Party for years. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022, bipartisan support for Ukraine was still relatively strong. Democrats largely backed military assistance. Many Republicans did as well, even if they disagreed over the size or duration of aid. But as the war dragged on, that consensus slowly weakened. Americans began asking difficult questions. How long should the United States stay involved? How much should taxpayers contribute? What does success actually look like? And perhaps most importantly, what are America's core national interests? There were no easy answers then. There still aren't today. Unlike debates over taxes or immigration, foreign policy requires balancing competing priorities. Supporting allies can strengthen America's global position, but overseas commitments also carry financial, military, and political costs. Conservatives who disagree over Ukraine often aren't arguing about whether America matters. They're weighing those costs differently. That's an important distinction. Too often, complex foreign policy debates get reduced to slogans. Support Ukraine, and you're called a warmonger. Question aid, and you're accused of helping Russia. Reality is considerably more complicated than either accusation. But here's where the discussion becomes much bigger than Ukraine itself. The real disagreement inside today's Republican Party isn't whether America should come first. It's about what putting America first actually requires. For some conservatives, the answer is clear. After the costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Washington should become far more cautious about overseas commitments. America should rebuild its economy, secure its borders, strengthen its manufacturing base, and avoid being drawn into conflicts that don't directly threaten the homeland. Others see the lesson differently. They argue that American leadership is itself a strategic asset. If aggressive powers are allowed to redraw borders by force without meaningful resistance, the long-term costs to America's security, alliances, and economy could be far greater than the cost of supporting partners today. In other words, both sides believe they're defending American interests. They're simply making different strategic calculations. That's why this debate has proven so difficult to resolve. It isn't just about Ukraine. It's about America's role in the 21st century. Should Washington continue serving as the world's primary security guarantor? Or should it become much more selective about when and how it chooses to lead? Those questions won't disappear when the war ends. If anything, they'll become even more important. Loomer's trip to Ukraine became symbolic for exactly that reason. Supporters argued that witnessing missile damage and speaking with civilians naturally changes a person's perspective. Critics countered that foreign policy can't be driven by emotion alone. In reality, both observations have merit. Seeing human suffering matters. But governments also have to weigh military realities, economic constraints, alliance commitments, and long-term national interests. Compassion and strategy aren't opposites. Successful foreign policy requires both. Another reason Loomer's comments attracted so much attention is her relationship with President Trump. Although she doesn't speak for the administration, she's long been viewed as someone with unusual access to Trump's political circle. That inevitably led many observers to wonder whether her change of heart reflected broader conversations taking place behind the scenes. At this point, however, there's simply no evidence to support that conclusion. One person's opinion doesn't redefine an entire political movement, nor does it automatically signal a shift in White House policy. Political realignments usually happen gradually. They begin with individual voices, scattered debates, and subtle changes in public opinion. Only later do those changes become obvious in retrospect. So perhaps the more interesting question isn't whether Laura Loomer has changed. It's whether more conservatives are beginning to re-examine assumptions that once seemed settled. That's something worth watching over the coming months. Because if more influential Republican figures start making similar arguments, the conversation inside the party could look very different by the next election cycle. And the consequences would extend well beyond Ukraine. In many ways, this debate reflects a much broader transformation in American foreign policy. For decades after World War II, Republicans and Democrats largely agreed that American prosperity and security depended on maintaining alliances, protecting global trade, and taking an active leadership role overseas. That consensus survived the Cold War, but it didn't survive the 21st century unchanged. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, growing national debt, economic dislocation, political polarization, and declining trust in institutions all led many Americans to question whether Washington had spent too much time trying to solve the world's problems while neglecting its own. That's the environment in which America First became far more than a campaign slogan. It became a challenge to many of the assumptions that had guided U.S. foreign policy for generations. Yet another reality is equally difficult to ignore. America remains deeply connected to the rest of the world. Its economy, financial system, military alliances, and global supply chains mean that conflicts thousands of miles away rarely stay there. Wars affect energy prices. Supply disruptions affect inflation. Cyber attacks cross borders instantly. Regional conflicts can quickly become global economic problems. That means the real debate today isn't engagement versus isolation. America no longer has that luxury. The real question is how America should engage. When should military power be used? When should economic pressure take the lead? How much responsibility should allies assume? And which conflicts truly involve vital American interests? Neither party has found universally accepted answers, which is exactly why stories like Laura Loomer's attract so much attention. They're not simply about one political figure changing her opinion. They're snapshots of a much larger national conversation about leadership, responsibility, and America's place in an increasingly uncertain world. Changing your mind shouldn't automatically make someone a hero, nor should it make someone a traitor. Healthy democracies depend on people being willing to reconsider evidence, challenge assumptions, and debate ideas without immediately questioning one another's motives. Public figures should absolutely be asked why their opinions changed. What new evidence convinced them? Do their new conclusions stand up to scrutiny? Those are fair questions, but treating every change of opinion as political betrayal only discourages honest debate. Ultimately, only time will tell whether Laura Loomer's shift represents something larger inside the Republican Party. It may become an early sign of a broader realignment, or it may simply remain the story of one activist whose first-hand experience changed her perspective. Either outcome is entirely possible. What seems far more certain is this: the debate over Ukraine has evolved into something much bigger than Ukraine itself. It's forcing Americans to reconsider fundamental questions about their country's future. How should the United States balance domestic priorities with global leadership? How much responsibility should America continue carrying for international security? And what does America First really mean in an increasingly interconnected world? The answers to those questions won't shape only America's policy toward Ukraine. They'll influence future debates over Taiwan, NATO, the Middle East, China, and every major foreign policy challenge that follows. That's why this story matters. Not because one political influencer changed her opinion, but because it reminds us that America's foreign policy is still evolving, and so is the conversation surrounding it. Thanks for watching.